Late August 1944. France. The morning sun crept across the fields, casting long shadows over a war-torn land. Inside a cramped, dimly lit observation post, a report lay crumpled on the desk. German technical officers of Flak Regiment 155W bent over it, struggling to comprehend the latest figures. But this story isn't about them. It's about women. Thousands of them, silenced, broken, forgotten. Women who carried scars not just on their bodies, but deep within their souls. They were called comfort women. The phrase itself was a cruel mask, a soft name to cover a monstrous truth. Japan's military, in its relentless march across Asia and the Pacific, had constructed an industrial system of exploitation. From Korea to China, from the Philippines to Burma, women were dragged away from their homes, their villages, their families. Some were lured with false promises of work, others simply taken at gunpoint. And once inside those comfort stations, there was no escape. Imagine it, a girl of 16. Maybe she had just been laughing with friends the day before, carrying water from the well, dreaming of marriage, of children. Suddenly, her door is kicked open. Soldiers storm in. She screams, fights, pleads. But it doesn't matter. By nightfall, she is locked inside a foreign barrack, stripped of her clothes, her dignity, her name. The Japanese military called it service to the empire, but it was nothing less than slavery. Day after day, night after night, these women were forced to endure the unendurable. Sometimes dozens of men in a single day. No mercy. No choice, no humanity. The walls of those rooms held the sound of muffled cries, whispered prayers, and footsteps that never seemed to end. And when their bodies broke down, when disease spread, when the women became too weak to continue, they were discarded like objects, buried in shallow graves, forgotten by their captors, abandoned by history. And yet the empire's machinery moved on, cold, efficient, ruthless. But here is where the story bends. For while the Japanese military built its empire on suffering, the Americans did not follow that path. When U.S. forces advanced across the Pacific, seizing islands one by one, they refused to replicate Japan's system of sexual enslavement. Yes, American soldiers sought companionship, comfort, moments of escape from the horror of war. But they did not build an empire of brothels. They did not industrialize human suffering in the same way. This refusal, this moral line drawn in the chaos of war, stands as a haunting contrast. Because for the comfort women, there was no refusal. There was no choice, only silence. And that silence would follow them long after the guns went quiet. The Americans' refusal, that refusal drew a line in history. But for the women left behind in abandoned garrisons, jungle huts, and crumbling stations, the silence became their prison. The war ended. The empire crumbled. The flags changed, yet their pain remained. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the world celebrated liberation. Fireworks, parades, kisses in the streets of New York. Soldiers returned home to tearful reunions. Nations breathed again. But for the comfort women, there was no parade. Instead, many of them stumbled out of brothels and barracks like ghosts, their bodies frail, their eyes hollow. Some were so broken by disease that they could hardly walk. Others carried children in their arms, children fathered by men whose faces they did not even know. And when they returned home, there was no welcome. In Korea, daughters who had been stolen away were often rejected by their families. Shamed, they called them, untouchable. In the Philippines, survivors hid their past, never daring to tell their husbands or children what they had endured. In China, many never married. Many bore no children. Their lives cut short not by bombs, but by shame. And history, the official history, written by generals, judges, and politicians, buried them deeper. At the Tokyo trials, where Allied powers gathered to judge the crimes of the Japanese Empire, comfort women were mentioned, briefly, just a footnote, a whisper in a sea of testimony about massacres, poison gas, and forced labor. The women were not called to testify. Their names were not written into the record. Their suffering was filed away in silence. Justice did not come. And so the decades rolled on. The 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. Whole generations grew up never knowing what had happened. School books in Japan skipped over it. Politicians called it regrettable or denied it entirely. Some even claimed the women had volunteered, that they had been paid prostitutes, not slaves. A lie, a cruel, calculated lie. Meanwhile, the women aged, their hair turned gray, their backs bent with time, and still they kept their silence. But silence cannot last forever. In the 1990s, 50 years after the war, the voices began to rise. It began with just a few. Brave women, trembling, standing before cameras, before microphones, their hands shaking, their voices breaking. I was 15 when they took me. I was locked in a room and forced to serve soldiers every day, every night. I never told my husband, I never told my children, but now I will tell the world. Their courage ignited something powerful. Suddenly, the silence was broken across Asia, in Korea, in the Philippines, in Taiwan, in China. Survivors stepped forward. Their testimonies were raw, painful, unflinching. The world listened. For the first time in half a century, the world listened. But even then, justice was slow. Lawsuits were filed against the Japanese government. Some survivors won symbolic victories. Others were dismissed. Their claims too old, their voices not enough. Politicians in Tokyo argued, denied, deflected. Memorials were erected and then protested. Every step forward was met with resistance. And so the women, now grandmothers with trembling hands, kept speaking week after week, year after year, standing in front of embassies with signs, chanting through tears, demanding one thing: remember us. Remember us. Because memory is the only weapon left to the powerless. And for those who survived, memory became both curse and shield. A curse because every night they relived the horrors of their youth. A shield because by telling their stories, they ensured that the world could never again pretend they did not exist. And yet, the fight over memory continues, even today. In classrooms, textbooks are still edited. In politics, words like apology are weighed like gold. Statues of comfort women, bronze figures of young girls seated in quiet defiance are erected in cities around the world. Some stand proudly, surrounded by flowers. Others are defaced, protested, torn down. Even in death, these women cannot escape the battle. But perhaps that is their final testament, that the truth they carried silent for so long now roars across generations. The Americans' refusal marked a line, but the women's voices carved history itself. And still, we return to the peaches, the soap, the silence. Because history is not only written in battles and treaties, it is written in the quiet things we almost forget: the bar of soap left behind, the taste of fruit in a stolen. History is not only about what happened. It is about what we choose to remember and what we try to forget. The story of the comfort women forces us to look into that uncomfortable space between silence and truth, between denial and remembrance. For decades, their names were erased, their voices muted, their pain hidden, and yet they endured. Imagine them now. Old women, faces lined by years, hands trembling as they hold faded photographs of the girls they once were. Behind every wrinkle, behind every scar, lies a story the world almost never heard. One woman recalled how she used to sing while she worked in the fields of Korea, her voice echoing through the hills. After the war, she never sang again. She said, "The music was taken from me. I could not find it anymore." Another woman in the Philippines kept a small wooden comb. Soldiers had broken nearly everything she owned, but the comb she hid in her sleeve. Every morning after the war, she brushed her hair with it, whispering to herself, "I am still me. I am still here." These are not just memories. They are testaments, proof of survival. And survival itself is a kind of defiance, because the empire that enslaved them no longer stands. The soldiers who brutalized them have turned to dust. And if we forget them, we forget ourselves. Think again of the peaches, sweet fruit pressed into trembling hands by a soldier who for one fleeting moment remembered his own sister, his own daughter, his own humanity. Think of the bar of soap left behind like a quiet apology in a room that reeked of cruelty. Think of the silence, not empty, but full of everything unsaid. These fragments remind us that even in war there were choices. Some chose brutality. Some chose indifference. A few chose kindness. But every choice mattered. Every choice shaped lives. Now, as the survivors leave us one by one, as their voices fade into history, it becomes our responsibility to remember, to tell their stories, to carry the weight of their silence so that it is never silent again. Because memory is the only justice left. The war ended. The flags changed. The world moved on. But the echoes of those women, their cries, their whispers, their courage, still drift through the quiet corners of history. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them. Not as forgotten shadows, but as voices that never fade. History does not vanish when the war ends. It lingers, it echoes, it waits for someone to listen. The comfort women were once silenced, buried under shame, under politics, under denial. But today, their voices live in classrooms, in memorials, in stories like this one. When you walk past a bronze statue of a girl sitting in quiet defiance, you are not simply seeing art, you are seeing history staring back at you. A history that refuses to be erased. Every wrinkle on the survivors' faces carries the weight of battles fought in silence. Every word they spoke in trembling voices broke through decades of forgetting. And now it is our turn. Our turn to remember. Our turn to carry their story forward. And that is the weight of memory. If this story touched you, if these voices moved you, then I invite you to walk with me a little further. This channel is a place where history breathes again, where the forgotten are remembered, where the past is told not in cold dates and numbers, but in human voices, in human hearts. If you felt the weight of these stories, if you believe, like I do, that memory matters, then please subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who should hear it. Because every time you do, you help keep these voices alive. And together, we make sure they are never forgotten.